Somewhere over the North Sea, in the summer of 1939, the world's largest rigid airship was doing something it would never publicly acknowledge. The LZ-130 Graf Zeppelin II, 245 meters of duralumin and hydrogen, driven by 4 Mercedes-Benz diesel engines, cruised along Britain's eastern coastline at altitude, ostensibly on a test flight. Inside the gondola, technicians under the direction of Generalmajor Wolfgang Martini, chief of the Luftwaffe's communications service, hunched over signals equipment. Their job was straightforward: intercept whatever radio emissions were pouring from the strange new towers that German agents had been photographing from the ground for months. The towers were hard to miss. Steel lattice structures, some reaching 360 feet, had been sprouting along Britain's eastern and southern coasts by 1939 and 1940. An Abwehr agent in England had reported their locations, describing them as UKV radio stations, easily identifiable by their characteristic steel or wooden towers with antennas. The information was classified as exceptionally important. Martini knew the British were building something. He needed to know what. During the course of the flight, all Martini and his technicians picked up was unidentified crackling. They returned to Germany as ignorant as they'd departed. After processing the recorded signals and photographs, German intelligence reached a conclusion that would shadow the next year of the air war. British radio detection research was lagging far behind Germany's own program. The towers were noted, catalogued, and effectively shelved. Across the Channel, the British had tracked the Graf Zeppelin on the very system Martini was trying to study. The Luftwaffe didn't lose the air war over Britain because its analysts failed to notice chain home. They photographed the towers, intercepted the signals, dispatched the world's largest airship to study them, and eventually bombed the stations directly. The failure ran deeper than blindness. Germany saw chain home clearly, measured it against its own technically superior radar systems, and concluded it was crude, inflexible, and strategically unimportant. That assessment was wrong at every level that mattered. And in the summer of 1940, it may have been one of the costliest analytical errors of the entire war. To understand why German experts reached that conclusion, you have to see chain home through their eyes. Through those eyes, it genuinely did look primitive. The system traced its origins to 26 February 1935, when Scottish physicist Robert Watson Watt and his colleague Arnold Wilkins conducted what became known as the Daventry experiment. Using a BBC shortwave transmitter and a receiver set up in a frosty field near Weedon, they bounced radio waves off a Handley Page Hayford bomber and tracked the reflected signal on a cathode ray oscilloscope. The spot moved as the aircraft passed, and kept moving until it was 8 miles away. The Air Ministry had originally asked Watson Watt about the feasibility of a radio death ray, a weapon that could disable enemy aircraft with concentrated energy. His assistant Wilkins ran the numbers and demonstrated the idea was physically impossible. But Wilkins recalled a 1932 General Post Office report documenting how aircraft flying near a radio receiver caused the signal to fade. He suggested the effect could be used for long-range detection instead. Watson Watt reported back to the committee that the death ray was extremely unlikely, adding that attention was being turned to the still difficult but less unpromising problem of radio detection. He requested £12,000, but the ministry initially gave him £2,000 for a demonstration. Within months, ranges were reaching 100 miles. By 1936, a prototype station was operating at Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast. By September 1939, 20 chain home stations stood along Britain's eastern coast. By July 1940, the network had grown to 22 chain-home stations and 30 chain-home low stations, covering Britain's most exposed southern and eastern approaches. The entire chain, from theoretical concept to operational coastal defence, had taken less than 5 years to build, at a cost of roughly £10 million. The speed came with deliberate compromises. Watson Watt operated under what he called the cult of the imperfect. His principle was blunt. Always strive to give the military the third best, because the best is impossible, and second best is always too late. Chain-home was assembled from commercially available components wherever possible, not precision-engineered instruments. Its technical specifications reflected that philosophy. Chain-home transmitted on frequencies between 22 and 30 MHz at wavelengths of 10 to 13.5 meters, with a power output of 200 kilowatts. At high altitudes, it could detect aircraft up to 120 miles away. The system worked between roughly 25,000 and 1,000 feet, effective against bomber formations at operational height, but functionally blind to anything below 1,000 feet. Chain-home low, operating at 200 MHz on a 1.5 meter wavelength with 150 kilowatts, pushed coverage down to 500 feet, but couldn't reach to sea level. The aerials didn't rotate. Chain-home transmitted a broad, fixed beam across a wide sector, more floodlight than searchlight, while operators determined bearing by turning a goniometer knob to null out the signal blip on their screen and reading the angle from a calibrated scale. Each station demanded intense human interaction. The system's official designation was Air Ministry Experimental Station Type 1, AMES Type 1, and its working name, RDF, stood for Radio Direction Finding. That was a deliberate misnomer, adopted for security, masking the system's true function behind a name that sounded like existing navigation equipment. Compare this with what Germany had. The Freya radar, operational by 1938, transmitted at 250 MHz on a 1.2 meter wavelength. Compact, rotating antennas with narrow beams. Precise target tracking. The Würzburg, an even more refined fire control radar, used a parabolic dish to lock onto individual aircraft with striking accuracy. Both systems were technically ahead of anything chain-home could offer. By any reasonable engineering comparison, the British hardware looked like something from the previous decade. Chain-home had serious shortcomings, but it was skillfully melded to an innovative command and control system. German analysts perceived the shortcomings. They never perceived what it was melded to. Chain-home was never designed to be a standalone weapon. It was the tripwire of the most sophisticated air defense network on the planet. Germany never grasped what sat behind those towers. The system carried the name of the man who built it, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, Commander-in-Chief of RAF Fighter Command. The Dowding system was the world's first wide-area ground-controlled interception network, and its development hadn't been accidental. It grew from hard-won lessons about the limitations of radar alone. Radar alone couldn't direct fighters effectively. Dowding's response was architectural. He built a hierarchical reporting chain that took the fire hose of raw radar data and compressed it into a decision tool that controllers at every level could actually use. The information flow ran in a precise sequence. Chain-home and chain-home low stations detected incoming aircraft over the sea approaches and converted their readings into grid coordinates. Those coordinates went by dedicated landline telephone, not radio, to the filter room at Fighter Command Headquarters, Bentley Priory. The filter room was the bottleneck by design. Multiple stations might report the same formation at slightly different positions. Filterers reconciled those reports into a single track, assigned it a number, estimated its size, altitude, and heading, and placed coloured markers on a central plotting table. The colours corresponded to 5-minute segments on a sector clock, so anyone watching could tell at a glance how old each piece of information was. Filtered tracks then flowed down to Group headquarters. Number 11 Group at RAF Uxbridge covered London and the South East, where most of the fighting would occur, and from groups to sector operations rooms. At each level, controllers recreated the relevant piece of the air picture on their own plotting tables. Group commanders assigned sectors to respond. Sector controllers, the people closest to the aircraft, decided which squadrons to scramble, when to scramble them, and what vectors to fly. The Observer Corps filled the critical gap that Chain Home couldn't. 30,000 volunteers, trained in aircraft recognition, staffed roughly 1,000 posts across Britain. Once enemy aircraft crossed the coastline and passed beyond radar coverage, the observers tracked them visually, reporting altitude, heading, and formation strength by telephone into the same network. As the Imperial War Museums describe them, largely made up of volunteers who trained themselves in aircraft recognition, the Observer Corps played a crucial role during the Battle of Britain as part of the Dowding system. Every element was connected by thousands of miles of private post office landlines. It was invisible to reconnaissance cameras. It was undetectable on a signals intercept flight. Unless you understood it existed, you'd assume the coastal towers were the whole system. A string of independent radar sets, each working alone, each vulnerable if knocked out. With the Dowding system fully operational during the Battle of Britain, Fighter Command could intercept raids far more efficiently. The system gave roughly 20 minutes warning of incoming attacks. Churchill captured the implication precisely. All the ascendancy of the Hurricanes and Spitfires would have been fruitless but for this system, which had been devised and built before the war. The Luftwaffe had nothing like it, and because it had nothing like it, its intelligence apparatus couldn't conceive that Britain did. German air intelligence was structurally compromised in ways that went beyond individual incompetence. The Luftwaffe's intelligence branch, the 5th Abteilung, was subordinated to the operations staff. Intelligence officers were perceived, according to post-war assessment, as maids of all work, staffed with low-quality personnel whose inputs were considered of limited usefulness. Information passed largely vertically, seldom horizontally. More than a dozen intelligence agencies competed across the German state, none fully cooperating with the others. Even within the Luftwaffe itself, the rivalry between the 5th Abteilung and Martini's 3rd Abteilung, the signals intelligence branch that had actually detected British radar, was so acute that the two rarely coordinated. That friction, in the judgment of historians who examined the wreckage, led directly to erroneous assessments. At the head of the 5th Abteilung sat Colonel Joseph Beppo Schmid, a man who became known within the Luftwaffe for a quality no intelligence chief should advertise. Garnishing his reports to make them more palatable to Goering, Schmid's pre-war output established the pattern that would persist through the battle itself. In May 1939, Schmid issued a report concluding that France and Britain couldn't catch up with Germany's lead in Air Force expansion for 1 to 2 years. The report gave no credit to British radar systems, despite the fact that Martini's branch had already detected them. That omission shaped the larger conclusion. British air defences were judged inadequate to defend anything beyond the general area around London, leaving the rest of England open to attack. Between January and June 1939, Schmidt oversaw a broader study, codenamed Studie Blau, Blue Study, assessing British air power and economic capabilities. The 94-page report was, in the post-war assessment, a mixture of truth and falsehood. It concluded the German Luftwaffe was superior to any single European air force, not only to the numbers and quality of the equipment and armament of troops, but also to the organisation, training, and especially the tactical and command side of the preparation for war in the air. Somewhere between 31 and 51 target types were identified across Britain. No specific priority for their destruction was ever clearly established. Running in parallel and reaching the opposite conclusion were operational exercises conducted in May 1939 by General Helmut Felmy, commander of Luftflotte II. These exercises, conducted in the presence of Milch, Jeschonek and the chiefs of staff from Luftflotten I and III, found that German aircraft ranges were too short. There weren't enough bombers available, and crew training in instrument flying was inadequate. Felmy's assessment formed the basis of a follow-up staff appraisal warning that terror attacks on London would hardly have a catastrophic effect or contribute significantly to a war decision, and would only strengthen the British will to resist. Goering preferred Schmidt's version. Felmy was subsequently relieved of command on Hitler's orders. The deeper analytical blindness was doctrinal, not bureaucratic. Germany used radar competently. Freya and Würzburg were excellent instruments. But the Luftwaffe didn't centralize its radar data. It didn't filter multiple inputs into a unified air picture. It didn't operate a hierarchical command and control system capable of converting a radar detection into a fighter interception within minutes. Each German radar installation functioned as a local tool. Because the Luftwaffe didn't work that way, it never occurred to German analysts that fighter command might. Historian Stephen Bungay captured the problem in a single line. The core problem for Kesselring and Sperler was that they literally didn't know what they were doing. They knew about British radar. They didn't know how the RAF used it. Luftwaffe intelligence had no comprehension of fighter command as an integrated air defense system. Because the Luftwaffe didn't centralize its own radar data and filtering, it didn't occur to them that fighter command was truly a network, a system with integrated subsystems linked by post office landlines. The existence and function of the 7 sector stations, the nerve centers where controllers actually directed fighters into combat, remained invisible to German intelligence throughout the battle. Schmidt eventually learned from Martini's monitoring service that radar data was being passed to RAF fighters by radio. Rather than triggering reassessment, this confirmed his existing conclusion. He remained convinced that massed Luftwaffe attacks would overload what he believed was an inflexible system. In practice, massed formations were far easier to detect and track than scattered ones. The system wasn't overwhelmed by concentrated raids. It thrived on them. On August 12, 1940, the Luftwaffe made its most serious attempt to knock out the radar chain directly. German bombers launched a concerted series of raids against chain home stations along Britain's southern coast: Dunkirk in Kent, Pevensey and Rye in Sussex, and Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. Most sites suffered only superficial damage and returned to operation within hours. The tall steel transmitter towers, open girder frameworks, let high-explosive bombs pass through without collapsing the structure. Surrounding huts were hit, but buried cabling and reinforced equipment shelters absorbed much of the blast. Ventnor was the single serious casualty. 15 Junkers 88A bombers came in from over the sea and dropped 22 bombs of 500 kilograms and 52 of 250 kilograms on the station. Sheets of flame, intense fires, and thick smoke were observed. The transmitter was destroyed. Ventnor went off the air. A mobile chain-home low unit was deployed to the Isle of Wight within days. Partial radar coverage was restored by August 15th, 3 days after the attack. Full capability returned by August 18th. Adjacent stations at Poling and Worth Matravers extended their scanning arcs to compensate in the interim. The network never went blind. And here was the mechanism that turned a temporary German success into a permanent German misunderstanding. The British adopted a policy of continuing to transmit from damaged radar stations. Even when a station could no longer receive incoming signals, its transmitter kept broadcasting. German signals intelligence, monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum for any indication their raids had succeeded, picked up signals from stations they'd just bombed. The German conclusion was logical and completely wrong. The attacks weren't working. The stations were essentially unharmed. In concert with pilot reports that led the Germans to believe the vital radar components were housed in bomb-proof bunkers, attacks against the radar network weren't sustained. By August 15, 1940, the Luftwaffe was already moving away from sustained attacks on radar sites. The Ventnor transmitter his bombers had physically destroyed 3 days earlier was, at that moment, being replaced by mobile equipment. The network was adapting faster than the Luftwaffe could understand it. The operational consequences of that decision accumulated across every subsequent week of the battle. Fighter Command, with its radar chain intact, continued to receive those 20 minutes of warning. 20 minutes was enough time to scramble squadrons, climb to altitude, and position fighters directly in the path of German formations before they reached their targets. Pilots didn't have to fly fuel-draining standing patrols along hundreds of miles of coastline, hoping to stumble into the enemy. The system told them where the enemy was. Controllers told them where to go. The Dowding system allowed British aircraft to go up only when German aircraft had been identified as close by. Resources could be conserved. Pilots could recuperate between sorties. Aircraft could be serviced and refueled on the ground, rather than burning hours aloft. As one assessment concluded, without warning of incoming German aircraft, more RAF fighters would have been destroyed on their runways, and the Luftwaffe would have dropped more bombs on British cities. German bomber crews, meanwhile, faced a puzzle they couldn't solve. Every major raid was met by fighters that appeared, somehow, to know they were coming. On the 17th of August 1940, German intelligence estimated that Fighter Command was down to just 300 serviceable fighters. The actual number was 855, with another 289 at storage units and 84 at training units, totaling 1,438 machines, more than twice what the Luftwaffe believed existed. Loss assessments were routinely overstated by factors of 3 and 4. Following raids on the 17th of August, Luftwaffe intelligence claimed 11 airfields permanently destroyed and 12 severely damaged. All of them were operational. The intelligence gap between what Germany believed was happening and what was actually happening had become a chasm. And at the bottom of that chasm was a network of telephone lines, plotting tables, coloured markers, and sector clocks that German analysts had never mapped, never understood, and never attacked with any coherence. Germany's plan for Britain was sequential. The Luftwaffe would establish air superiority. Once the skies were clear, Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion, would proceed. Without air superiority, the German Navy couldn't protect a channel crossing against the Royal Navy. Without air superiority, the Wehrmacht couldn't land. The entire sequence depended on breaking Fighter Command first. Fighter Command didn't break. Damaged, strained, running on too few pilots and too many sorties, but never broken. The Dowding system, fed by chain home and connected by landlines, kept the RAF efficient enough to impose unsustainable losses. By mid-September 1940, German bomber crews, told for months that their enemy was virtually finished, were still encountering concentrated, coordinated resistance that appeared out of clear skies with uncanny precision. By the end of the battle, the Luftwaffe had lost roughly 1,700 aircraft and nearly all their crews. The British lost just over 900 aircraft, but saved about half their pilots. On September 17, 1940, Hitler postponed Sea Lion indefinitely. The RAF Museum frames the core historical question carefully. Was it radar, or the failure of Goering to appreciate its importance that led to the British victory? The honest answer involves both, and a dozen other factors besides. Radar alone didn't win the Battle of Britain. Chain home alone didn't save Fighter Command. The system did. Chain home's towers stood in plain view on the English coastline. 360 feet of steel lattice, visible from the air, from the sea, from the deck of the world's largest airship, flying low along the coast with listening equipment. German agents photographed them. German scientists analyzed their signals. German bombers attacked them. At every stage, German analysts drew the wrong conclusion. Not because the evidence was absent, but because they measured what they could see against the wrong standard. They compared Chain Home's crude hardware to Freya's precision engineering and concluded the British system was inferior. They were right about the hardware. They were catastrophically wrong about the system. Germany's radar was technically better. Britain's radar was operationally more dangerous because it fed something Germany didn't possess and couldn't imagine: an integrated, real-time, networked air defense architecture that turned a 20-minute warning into effective interception. Chain home didn't need to be elegant. It didn't need to rotate or operate on microwave frequencies or track individual aircraft with pinpoint accuracy. It needed to see formations assembling over France, estimate their bearing and altitude within a usable margin, and push that information through a telephone network to controllers who could put fighters in the right piece of sky before the bombers arrived. It did that every day through bomb damage and equipment failures and improvised repairs, because the weapon was never the towers. The weapon was the invisible network behind them. The Luftwaffe looked at Chain Home and saw a string of crude radio masts. What they failed to see was the front end of a system that would cost them air superiority over Britain, and with it, their last realistic opportunity to force the British out of the war before it spread beyond anyone's control. In 1940, that misunderstanding may have been one of the most expensive misreadings in military history. Subscribe for more stories like this.